reminder of the extraordinary courage that so many activists, journalists, lawyers, government officials, regular citizens who stand up to these abuses. Many do so at great personal risk of retaliation, harassment, detention, torture, even death. In February, we celebrated 10 Global Human Rights Defender awardees, individuals from around the world who are promoting and defending fundamental freedoms, from combating slavery to advocating for families of those forcibly disappeared, to demanding better wages and working conditions for low-income laborers, to representing political prisoners on death row. This report honors them. I'm also proud of my colleagues here at the State Department, in Washington, and at every post around the world, for not only reporting and documenting human rights abuses, but also drawing on the power and purpose of American diplomacy to advance human dignity. Now, as you know, I recently traveled to Ethiopia, where I had a very productive discussion with Prime Minister Abiy and his team. I also met with Getachew Reda, the TPLF signatory to the November 2nd cessation of hostilities agreement, who was just selected to be the leader of its interim administration. I commended both sides for reaching that agreement and the significant progress made in its implementation. With this agreement in place, the fighting is stopped. Humanitarian assistance is flowing. Services are being restored. Human rights in northern Ethiopia are significantly down. Eritrean forces are leaving. The Ethiopian government is taking the first steps toward transitional justice. But as I discussed with both sides during my visit, to build a durable peace, there must be acknowledgement of the atrocities committed by all parties, as well as accountability together with reconciliation. The conflict in northern Ethiopia was devastating. Men, women, and children were killed. Women and girls were subject to horrific forms of sexual violence. Thousands were forcibly displaced from their homes. Entire communities were specifically targeted based on their ethnicity. Many of these actions were not random or a mere byproduct of war. They were calculated and deliberate. After the department's careful review of the law and the facts, I've determined that members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Eritrean Defense Forces, Tigray People's Liberation Front forces, and Amhara forces committed war crimes during the conflict in northern Ethiopia. Members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, and Amhara forces also committed crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, and other forms of sexual violence and persecution. Members of the Amhara forces committed the crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer and committed ethnic cleansing through their treatment of Tigrayans in western Tigray. We welcome the commitment that the parties to the cessation of hostilities agreement have made to acknowledge the atrocities committed and their devastating consequences. The government of Ethiopia is taking the first steps by publicly releasing a detailed green paper of transitional justice options based upon best practices and building upon the experiences of other states emerging from periods of mass violence. It has invited experts from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to join the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to deploy a team of human rights monitors to conflict-affected areas to ensure that such acts have truly ceased. The government is also holding public consultations about transitional justice, which, as I discussed with the Prime Minister, should be inclusive of all stakeholders and provide victims a voice. The process is benefiting from the advice of experts in the field, including members of my team who participated in a workshop on transitional justice with other international specialists just last week. Finally and crucially, we urge the government of Ethiopia and the government of Eritrea, as well as the TPLF, to hold those responsible for these atrocities accountable. These steps, acknowledgement, accountability, reconciliation, are key to breaking the cycle of ethnic and political violence that has gripped Ethiopia and prevented it from reaching its unlimited potential for so long. The United States will partner with Ethiopia as it implements a credible transitional justice process for the benefit of all victims and affected communities. We'll stand with Ethiopia as it honestly faces the abuses in its past, provides accountability for the harms committed against its citizens, and moves towards a future of lasting peace. With that, happy to take a couple of questions before turning it over to my colleagues.
Matt, go ahead.
Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and welcome back.
Thank you.
I've got about 17 questions, but for the sake
Hold
of
on, let me get my pen out.
but for the sake of both you and my colleagues, I'll narrow it down to just one.
Thank you.
And that has to do with the Ethiopia and the decision you just made. As you noted, you were just there. Why didn't you make this determination either while you were there or before you went? Were your conversations while you were there instructive in making this? And then the other thing is on this, you seem to suggest that you think that Ethiopian courts can take care, can deal with this. That is not so much the case as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. And I'm just wondering why it is that you think that.
Thanks, Matt. Well, look, I'm obviously not going to get into the details of private discussions that I had, but two things. First, this determination is the product of a lot of very deliberate, detailed work. And we are, when we make these determinations, very focused on doing that work, making sure that we have the facts, that we apply them to the law, and all of that takes time and focus. It seemed appropriate to release the determination that we made as we're putting out the human rights report. And beyond that, I'd say that in terms of what happens next in Ethiopia, including what process they establish to provide for justice, for accountability, we'll see. I don't think that's been determined. What has been determined, and what I could see from my meetings and conversations last week, is a commitment on all sides to engage in this process of transitional justice, an acknowledgement of the atrocities that have been committed, again, by all sides in the course of this conflict in northern Ethiopia, and I believe a commitment to genuinely get to a better place that has to include accountability, that has to include, I think, reconciliation, if we're going to have a truly durable peace. That's what I heard on the trip. And again, I think the situation that we're seeing now in Ethiopia is vastly different than situations in other parts of the world, in that over the last 4 months, the steps that all sides have taken to implement the cessation of hostilities agreement has literally saved lives and changed lives for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. But that doesn't erase what happened over the last 2 years, which is why it is so important that we get this transitional justice process moving, and that there is accountability as well as reconciliation.
Mr. Secretary, Afghan situation also is very bad. Any message for our New Year? We celebrated our New Year. Please, you guys don't give me opportunity, any comment about Afghan women, and what's your message for our New Year? We celebrated, but Afghan women crying. I know you don't give me a chance. Sorry.